A lot of people out there think that you need a huge space to grow your very own garden, but that's just simply not true. No matter where you live or how much space you have or what your means are, any single person out there could start their very own container garden just like this, growing a wide variety of fruits, vegetables, fruit trees, flowers, herbs, and everything in between. So by the end of this video, the goal is that you will be able to choose which container is best from you, from plastic to terracotta, what plants will go in it, what's the best possible soil, and how to fertilize, water, and care for those plants long term. And as you can see around me, there is absolutely no limit to what can be grown in a container, whether it's a lime tree, blueberry bushes, roses, peppers, tomatoes, lettuce, herbs. Every single thing that you could think of can be grown in a container. And probably the most important thing to consider first is exactly which container you're going to be using. So the very first option that any gardener is probably going to run into when starting their very own container garden is going to be black plastic. Now, there are a lot of advantages to black plastic. Number one, it's extremely cheap. Number two, it comes in just about every shape, size that you could ever imagine. There's a 1 gallon, 3 gallon, 5 gallon, or even this 15 gallon, which I've been successfully growing fruit trees like loquats, apple trees, pretty much anything can grow inside of a black plastic pot. The other advantage is that they are actually impermeable to water. So water cannot leave through the black plastic pot at all, which is why they generally always have a bunch of drainage holes. Whether it's a bunch on the bottom or some on the side like this one, they're always going to have more than a single hole for drainage because there is literally no way for the water to escape except out the bottom or through evaporation out of the top. And drainage is going to be a very critical component to any container grow, no matter what it is, and we'll be talking about that throughout this whole video. Now, one other thing to consider when it comes to black plastic in particular is that this can heat up very quickly on a very sunny, warm day. So that can be a downside for some places. It could also be a benefit for early parts of the season. Now, plastic isn't limited to just the black plastic. There are also more sturdy black plastic or plastics like this one here, which is a self-watering container from Crescent. So the way this works is that it has a reservoir at the bottom that's filled with water, and then the tray is able to actually wick that up into the soil and allow your plant to grow. This is a more durable plastic. The downside, of course, is that this is going to cost you a lot more than a black plastic pot. The other consideration when it comes to plastic is that over time, some plastics, especially the cheaper pots, which is what this one is, where I have my big blueberry, will actually break down over time in the sun. They'll become brittle, they'll start to crack. They're not exactly going to be the most sightly, beautiful thing out there. Now, black plastic, of course, is a very utilitarian look, but as I've mentioned, you could get plastic in pretty much any color. There's a lot of advantages to it, but also some people just don't like the aesthetic. And when it comes to aesthetic though, there is one primary choice, and that is going to be terracotta. When it comes to terracotta, it is definitely the best looking of the bunch. I'm going to just state that as a fact because terracotta comes in a wide range of options. It usually comes unglazed, the classic terracotta color like you see right here, but terracotta can also be glazed like these pots over here. You could get blues, greens, any sort of color that you can imagine, but there is going to be a difference in growing in this pot versus this. As you can see, since this is glazed, what that means is that this is just as good at blocking water from leaving as a black plastic pot. There's no way for the water to evaporate through these walls, which means that their only way out is through a single hole on the bottom of the container. Now, this can be an advantage because it could mean that you have a plant that doesn't want to dry out very regularly. That would be great for this. It also means you don't have to water as often, but it could also be a little bit of a trap because if you do overwater this, it's going to have a very hard time drying out. Now, when it comes to standard terracotta, this, of course, is unglazed, which means that actually all the water can and will permeate through the walls and actually shed moisture. This is a fantastic benefit and actually a reason why I like unglazed like this for things like my lime tree over here, because citrus trees don't want to sit with wet roots. So having a terracotta wall means that the edges of that pot are probably always going to be a little bit dry, which should keep those roots much happier. The trade-off is that you're going to have to water more regularly and definitely make sure you add mulch to something like a unglazed terracotta. The disadvantage is that it's going to cost you a lot more than pretty much any other pot out there. They're also very heavy, they're fragile, they could break. This one's already chipping a little bit on the surface. So they're not all good, but if you have a place where you're going to want things to look good and entertain, you're probably going to want to go with terracotta or glazed terracotta. The other option is a wooden container, and a lot of times you see them like this as an elevated raised bed where they're actually elevating the container off the ground to make it a little bit easier to work in. And there's also, of course, the classic whiskey barrel option. The thing I really appreciate though about these elevated raised beds is that they're often deeper, they could be made into different shapes, and I could tend to grow things that are more interesting in them or more packed. Like this bed right here is a mix of Mediterranean herbs instead of just a single pot I have to jam everything into. And of course, there's always the aesthetic choice. Some people just like wood more. But when it comes to vegetable gardening, the most common and most popular recommendation is going to be a grow bag, aka a fabric bag. Now, the neat thing about these is that they're pretty affordable. They could be folded down and put away every single year when you're done with your grow. They have a lot of different advantages, such as having handles to move them around if you're in a small space trying to chase the sun. They also will allow a lot of breathing through them, which is a great thing if you live somewhere that has a rainy climate or a very humid climate where you need your pots to actually breathe better than anything else out there. Nothing is going to allow more airflow into your roots than something like a fabric grow bag. But what if you live somewhere like San Diego that's actually a little bit dry and a little bit hot? Well, that is why we also have our lined grow bags. Now, this will negate some of the advantage to something like this, because this liner here is basically going to stop the water from flowing out of the sides of the grow bag until it gets to this bottom section. The advantage of that, of course, is that you're able to retain the water up top, but the bottom will never sit and get drowned because all of this is still able to breathe. Now, the other nice thing about grow bags is they come in a variety of sizes. You could grow literally any sort of standard vegetable, and you could also grow multiples of them. Right here, I have a grow bag filled with something like 20 leeks. They look fantastic. They're growing perfectly fine. 2 squashes right here. Got some peppers in 5-gallon pots, some cucumbers in the back there, and plenty of tomatoes. So we've covered all of our container basics. Now let's talk about soil, what plants to put in what, and I'll actually show you how to pot into a terracotta pot, as well as some veggies in these grow bags. But before we could plant anything in our containers, we do need some soil. And you might be thinking, I could just go out to the garden, I've got plenty of soil out there. But this is actually not the type of soil you want to use in your containers. This is what you would call garden soil. It's often sold as garden soil in nurseries or topsoil. And the reason why you don't want to use something like this in a container is that this is made out of loamy materials, things like silt, sand, and clay. And when silt, sand, and clay get water and confined in a container like this, what happens is all the sand will end up on top, the silt will end up in the middle, and you'll get a thick, stagnant layer of clay at the very bottom of your container that suffocates all of your plant's roots. It's going to get compacted, it's going to get stinky, and you're not going to succeed. And if you're wondering how I know, because in the beginning when I first started gardening, I planted one of my jalapeno peppers in a grow bag with native soil, and it did not last more than a month or two. So what are we going to use instead? Well, it's going to be something called potting soil. But what is potting soil if it isn't the natural dirt and soil that we find in our garden? Well, it's actually still natural stuff. It's things like peat, coconut coir. Those are going to be the bulk agents of your soils. Also forest products, which is just shredded up trees and barks and things like that. They're really good at retaining water. They can hold some nutrients and they allow the roots to anchor into something. But you can't just have stuff that holds water. You need aeration and drainage. Without air, plant roots will drown, which is why you normally have things like perlite, pumice, and vermiculite also added into a lot of soils. Perlite and pumice are really good at aeration and drainage because they don't really hold on to that much water and they allow air to flow through the soil. Vermiculite can hold a little bit of water, but overall it does help aerate. The other sort of thing that you might add into soils is some sort of fertility, whether it's compost or worm castings or even just straight up fertilizer. When you combine all these things together, you have everything a plant needs to actually grow in a container without actually getting compacted like a traditional garden soil would in a contained area. But in the world of potting soil, there are a lot of variations. So let me show you some of my favorites and also when I would use one over the other. That actually brings us to the sponsor of today's video, Fox Farm, which makes my 2 favorite potting soils, the ones that I've been using ever since I first started gardening, and that is Happy Frog and Ocean Forest. The thing that I really appreciate about Fox Farm is that they make soils full of life. They actually add mycorrhizal inoculants, which could form relationships with your plants to help them grow better and also withstand a little bit of drought stress better than plants that don't have that relationship. The other thing I really appreciate is that this is a high quality soil. The ingredients that go into them are fantastic. I've never had a plant suffer when I planted in this, but I have had it suffer when planted in other soils, which I won't be naming right now. The other thing I really appreciate about these 2 mixes in particular is that Happy Frog is a great all-purpose soil that I could use in pretty much any situation I could think of when growing in containers, as well as the Ocean Forest. But the Ocean Forest also has a little bit of sandy loam added to it. Otherwise, they're both made with H-Forest products, peat, perlite and some sort of fertilizer added, but the little bit of sandy loam in this is really fantastic for growing things like perennials when you're going to be leaving them in like a terracotta pot for a long period of time. So go to foxfarm.com and use our store locator to find a product near you, and for added convenience, they're also available on Amazon. So now let's talk about different plants that we could grow in different containers, how I'm going to use these soils. I'll show you an example of a few different annual plantings in containers, and also how to pot a perennial into a long-lived container. So I ended up filling a 5 and a 10-gallon grow bag with the Happy Frog soil. You could see just how rich it looks. It looks so nice and fluffy, plenty of drainage, and that's exactly what I'm looking for. So what are we going to do with something like a 5 and a 10-gallon pot? Well, honestly, the world is your oyster when it comes to annual vegetables. Let me give off a couple examples here. When you have something as big as 10 gallons, you could pretty much grow any of the major classics: tomato, pepper, eggplant, cucumbers, squash, any sort of fruiting plant that you could think of. You could pretty much pull it off reliably in a 10-gallon pot. But for something like an indeterminate tomato, for example, like a Cherokee Purple, you might want to consider going up to like a 15-gallon pot just to have a little bit of extra soil so you don't have to water as regularly. That's kind of the major difference when it comes to choosing different container sizes, is that the 5-gallon pot will simply dry out sooner than the 10-gallon pot because there's less soil in this than there is in that one. So think about that when you're trying to think of where you are located in terms of how hot it is, what you want to grow, and for how long you want to grow it. An indeterminate tomato is going to be alive for 6 months or so you want to make sure you have enough soil that it won't tap out early. So I would never put it in a 5-gallon pot. I would consider 10, but I'd go maybe up to 15. The other nice thing about containers is that you could, of course, transplant or direct sow. In my hands here, I have a couple different options that are great for actually direct sowing. Something like a bush bean or pole bean will do just fine. Then you have a determinate tomato like the Mountain Merit. Just throw a cage on that and it'll do just great in a 10-gallon bag. You got the Patio Choice little tomatoes. These ones are designed to go in even something like a small glazed terracotta pot. So 5 gallons should be plenty fine. Same as the Cherry Falls if you're looking for a small tomato. Then you have Space Master 80 if you're looking for a cucumber that doesn't get that big. This one caps out at about 3 feet. So something like a 10-gallon pot, that'll do just fine because it's not going to get massive and suck up all the water immediately. Then when it comes to actually choosing something more adventurous like a melon, the Minnesota Midget is a perfect variety. I would still go towards a 10 to 15-gallon pot because you really want to make sure you have water when growing melons, and same goes with Sugar Baby. They're both melons that grow a little bit smaller. They don't have as long vines, so they'll do just fine. Then you get into things like Hocus cucumbers, a more standard cucumber. Any type of summer squash like this Black Beauty here will do great. Definitely go up to 10 to 15. And then you get the wonderful world of bush beans. So let's actually go ahead and direct sow some bush beans in this 5-gallon pot here. The nice thing about bush beans is that you could plant them literally up right against each other. So when going in a container like this, it's no exception to that rule. So I'm gonna just dump a bunch of seeds in my hand. This is the Blue Lake 274 bush. So I'll show you exactly how these look when laid out in the grow bag. There's a couple different options here. You could either go in a circle where you have them roughly 4 to 6 inches apart. That is what I do in ground and raised beds. There's no difference in the container. So something like this can do just fine. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-ish beans. You could put one in the middle if you're feeling adventurous, but it's going to be a lot harder to harvest that. Your other option is to just go ahead and plant them in like 2 rows set apart. That'll make it a little bit more organized and easier to actually see the beans and harvest them. So in this case, I'll go ahead and do that. So I have 6 beans in a single 5-gallon pot, and I assure you that's going to produce quite a lot of beans. You'll be plenty happy with the harvest there. So what about this bigger container? Well, that's where it starts to get really interesting and fun in my experience. You could just go ahead and put a single determinate tomato in the middle, or even a single pepper would do just fine. But instead, you could also make it really interesting and build out companion planted gardens within each one of your grow bags. So right here I have a single pepper. I'm gonna go ahead and pull that out of our 4-inch pot there. I'm gonna put it right in the middle. So right there. You could walk away, but that'd be a pretty boring sort of pot. So let's make it a little more interesting. One of the nice things about peppers is that they will generally take probably at least a month to 2 before I could harvest anything out of here. And also the roots are so small now, they're not filling out the pot. So what can you do? Well, you could grow something like a quick growing plant, such as a baby green lettuce, a bok choy, anything that grows in something like 30 to 40 days, and plant it all around your pepper plant. The way this works is that this will root out and start using the soil on the edges. As the pepper continues to grow, you'll be able to harvest this lettuce, eat the lettuce, and then once you're eating the lettuce, your peppers will be now producing. So this way you get more out of your garden space, especially if you're limited. I would highly encourage that you always do some level of companion planting. So let's go ahead and get one more lettuce in here. And now you could leave it like this if you want, or you could also add in something like a flower. So right here I have the lemon drop marigold. I believe this is one of the varieties that doesn't get as big. It even looks a little bit dwarfed right here. So I'm not gonna put all 4 of them that survived in here. I'm gonna pinch it down to just 2. And what I'll do is I'll put that right on the edge of this pot here. So this will be in here. Actually, you know what? Let's go ahead and split that double seedling. I'll put one there. I'll put one in the back. This will be here for the long haul. You could remove it if you feel like it's competing with your pepper too much. But now what you're going to have is lettuce in a few weeks, or actually in like a month or so. Then you'll start getting your peppers. At that point, the marigolds will be probably about this big, covered in flowers, looking really beautiful. And you have a much more interesting garden than just a single plant in a pot. So you have a lot of flexibility here. And when you have a high quality soil like Happy Frog, it's much easier to support that sort of vigorous plant growth. Now, what about actually trellising and supporting those plants? Well, again, you have many options just like you do in ground. You could do something like a cage like this guy right here. Just go ahead and slide that right over your pepper plant, and that's not going to get in the way of anything. You could still have the support of the cage, or if you want things to be a little bit simpler, you could also just go ahead and grab a bamboo stake. You could go right in at the edge of your pepper plant, put that there, tie a piece of string to it, and that's really all you need when supporting a pepper plant. Now, there is one more thing that I would suggest that anyone does if they're growing in containers. It's actually going to be fertilizing. But before we get into fertilizing, because I don't actually suggest you fertilize all the time at the beginning, is actually mulching this pot. So right here, I have a little bucket of straw mulch. And what this is going to do is, especially when you have multiple plants in a pot, it's going to make it much easier to keep these plants happy. This mulch is doing a few different things for us. It will technically stop any weeds from germinating in our grow bags. That's not really a problem I normally have though. But what I do have is that the surface can dry out very quickly. So this is going to help us conserve a ton of water in our containers and also keep the temperature a little bit lower, allowing our lettuce to thrive and grow without any sort of issue. So mulch is something I would recommend always, especially if you have your grow bag exposed to a more windy area or in full sun. It'll do wonders to keeping all that water retained in the soil and keep your plants happy. So now, let's talk about actually watering these containers now that we have one planted out. I have a variety of containers of different ages of different plants, and each one requires a little bit different of a strategy when it comes to watering. Before we get into watering our containers themselves, it reminded me that this rose right here is in desperate need of repotting because it is struggling to get enough water. Once you have something living in a container for some number of years, let's say 2 to 3, you tend to start getting a lot of roots building up. The soil starts to disappear out the drainage hole. And what you end up with is a bunch of roots that have a really hard time holding on to water, which is a great time to actually pot up into something bigger. Generally, you want to go to something about 2 to maybe 3 times the size. So this glazed terracotta here should be a perfect analog for the plastic, which is essentially the same amount of drainage level. So what are we going to do? We're going to be using the ocean forest because again, it has that sandy loam component, which means that it's not going to break down as fast, which means that this plant can live in this container for maybe an extra year or 2. Now, the other thing that I tend to use ocean forest for is for indoor plants and for starting my seedlings or potting up the seedlings. They tend to grow really well once potted up into something like this. So I have my big gloves on that should protect me from the rose. But before we deal with the rose itself, I'm going to go ahead and fill the bottom half of this pot with the ocean forest and see if we could get to essentially this height right here from the rose itself. So I have the soil right about there in the container now. So what we need to do is get this rose out of here. What I have here is a handy little mason's trowel. This is a pointing trowel, and all you need to do is you could run it along the edge here. You could use anything you have on hand. I've used a cake decorating spatula before. Anything that basically helps break up any roots that might be stuck on the edge of the pot. And this is especially handy if you're doing this to a terracotta pot because you can't really hit the sides to loosen the roots like you can on this plastic pot. So since this is plastic, what I'll do instead is I'll go like this. You're just kind of smacking the sides of the pot as you go around it. So now the scary part, since this is a rose, I can't hug it. So I'm gonna just flip this. We're gonna lose some soil, that's fine. You could see how much roots have built up on the bottom here. It's basically root bound. So what I'm going to do is try to break off this bottom section just to get any roots that might be wrapped around. Looks like I perfectly guessed the amount of soil to initially put in there. You could see that the root base of this rose itself is right here, which is just at the level, essentially right at the top of this pot. So That's pretty ideal. But the other thing that we're considering here is what is the shape of the plant we're putting in here? Since it already has a lean to the branches, what I'm going to do is try to offset that a little bit so it looks a little bit more vertical in general. And now I still have a lot of space around here. So what I'm going to do is start backfilling. Now, whenever you're filling a container, you don't want to like jam it in there and really force it. You want to let it loosely settle in. You could try watering it in if you're worried that it's not reaching everywhere you want, but forcing it is just going to lead to compaction over time. One of the things I mentioned earlier when we potted that pepper into the grow bag was that I wasn't adding fertilizer at that moment. Both Happy Frog and Ocean Forest have some amount of fertility built in at the beginning, which should help most plants grow for, let's say, about a month or so. But in this case, this is already an established perennial rose. It's already in the blooming season, so there's no harm at all in adding fertility at this point. So what I have here is the Happy Frog Fruit and Flower. That's why I chose this one, because this is a flower, has an NPK of 493, and that middle number 9 is the one that encourages flowering, and that's what I want to do, especially since I just repotted this. I want to make sure it has enough fertility to get some extra blooms. So in this case, I don't have my measuring cup on me, but for something like this, that's an established plant, it actually says that I could add a cup to it. So I'm going to start off with a good handful. And what I'm going to do is scatter it around the entire perimeter. And now I like to kind of work it into the soil to some level, and then we'll go ahead and bury in the rest of the depth of this pot and water it, and this rose should be ready to thrive. I guarantee you it's going to love this new home. It's a little bit higher, so I'll get more sun in my patio. It has essentially an entire bag of Ocean Forest added to it, and we've now added a bunch of fertility. So this guy's gonna be ready to go. It's gonna live a great life. So now let's talk about how to actually water and how to tell how much water a big container needs versus a small container, because it could get a little bit tricky in the long run. Honestly, watering is one of the most difficult things that you'll ever have to learn as a gardener, and it's something that you'll probably learn through your entire lifespan as a gardener. The main issue is that overwatering and underwatering can both cause the same issues in your plants. Yellowing leaves, overwatering, underwatering. Wilting leaves, overwatering, underwatering. So how can you actually tell how much water your plants need? Well, that's the other thing, is it's going to be variable depending on the pot you use and the time of season. Let's take this tomato right next to me for an example. It's in a fabric bag and it's been alive now for, I say, about 6 months. It has big old fruits on it. It's really taller than me. This is going to need a substantially larger amount of water than any of these other pots around it that are much smaller. So it's going to need water on a more regular basis, and it's going to need more just because the plant is now mature. But what about a freshly planted plant like the ones that we just did? Well, something like this, what I would do is I would come down at the base of the plant itself. I would water all around the grow bag because I put plants on every single edge of it. I don't want to just hit water in the middle. What I'm going to do here is just kind of add water until I see that it's barely sitting on the surface of the soil. Once it does that, I'm confident that it is now watered enough. If the water just flowed immediately through, that's a sign that it's probably too dry. If it immediately started pulling on the surface, that's a sign that it's definitely too wet. So what about these guys over here? Well, for a bigger pot like this that's 10 gallons, I might want to water for something like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. See how the water is pulling? That is a sign that this has already been watered enough, and that's why it looks so dark to begin with. Now, what about a 5-gallon pot? I could do 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's already starting to pull. So at that point, I feel confident that that is enough water, but you don't want to do this. You don't want to just go, and that's enough water. When you do water your plants, make sure you water enough that water actually comes out at the base. So right here, you could see it's starting to drain out a little bit, and maybe I even need a little bit more. That is kind of one way to tell, but really the most surefire thing that you could do is just bend over. If you have handles, pick up the pot. If it feels heavy, then almost certainly it's going to have enough water. If it feels really light, like let's try this one, see, I could lift that with just a couple fingers. Obviously that is much drier. So what's the other thing we could do? Well, we could do the finger test. So I'm gonna take my finger here, I'm gonna poke it into this one that's wet. When it comes out, my finger is brown, it's covered in soil. It's actually looking like it's a little bit too wet. Now, what about this guy over here? If I take my finger, put it in, it comes out with nothing on it. That is a sign of dry soil. So the finger test is pretty tried and true. You wanna go up to your knuckle here. And if you don't have any soil stick at all, also, I'm sure the soil will feel dry, then you know it is too dry. If your finger comes up dirty like this, with the soil completely sticking to it, then you definitely have enough water and you might even have too much. So honestly, for me, the main thing I do is I'll just kind of pick up the bags a little bit. Like this one feels crazy heavy. Another option is you just take your foot and just try to move it. If it moves really easily, then almost certainly it's too dry. So those are kind of my tips for you. I always recommend mulching, especially as you get into summer, but that's kind of the complicated way of answering how to actually water. Now, what about plants that have been growing for a long time? How do you care for them? Let's look at this tomato again. As you can see, I put this cage around it, but clearly the tomato plant had other plans. It is now 2 to 3 times past that tomato cage. So what do you have to do? Well, you have to figure out a way to support it. In this case, I'm in the greenhouse. I was able to tie twine to my roof, and even then I've run out of space. So that is something to always remember when you are growing in containers. Now, the other thing I'll mention is that once a plant has been in a pot for, let's say, over 3 months, you really have to fertilize it. Fertilizer is not an option when it comes to growing in a container. The soil that you put in there is the only fertility that is available to those plants. They simply cannot thrive on just potting soil alone. So there are a couple different ways to do it. You could come down at something like this and add granular fertilizer to the surface of the soil here and just add a little fresh soil or cover it back up, and that'll do just fine. Or you could get liquid fertilizer and apply it every week or every other week, and that should give enough fertility to support those plants. So now we know how to choose containers, we know how to use the soil, what plants we could grow, all the different options, and even how to pot up perennial plants and care for long-term things like this tomato. Hopefully this gives you guys a solid foundation on growing in containers to get you started and to make you confident to know that you could really grow whatever you want. You're not limited by not having access to the ground. Containers are a great option for everyone at home. If you want another video on how to grow in containers, I do have a couple on tomatoes right over here.